What's wrong with psychology? Previously, we said we are dropping the demarcation problem and now trying to draw a line within science, an epistemically meaningful line between good and junk science. To do that, we said we will look at specific cases. We have already discussed cases of scientists cheating and getting caught, being falsely accused of cheating, and even what we called pathological science, a collective delusional state in which some significant numbers of scientists see and report things that are unreal. In cognitive neuroscience, we even examined a field where a whole bunch of smart people might be wasting away dozens of millions in research funds just to take pictures of brains that don't tell anything useful about how the mind works. Today we will look at a similar case, experimental psychology, which seems to be making little progress towards explaining and predicting the phenomena it studies, despite decades of hard work by the best talent and significant research investment. As you would remember, experimental psychology is in fierce competition with cognitive neuroscience. Both disciplines are aiming to explain and predict mental phenomena. Last time we examined Jerry Fodor's criticism of cognitive neuroscience. His charges were grim. fMRI, he said, the only and extremely expensive research tool of cognitive neuroscience, doesn't work as intended. What it tells us is not useful for understanding how the mind works. Fodor also did a lot of winking and gesturing towards the other end of the aisle, where we find experimental psychology, where researchers theorize about the mental processes as input-output machines. We did a little bit of theorizing ourselves and figured out, at least we hope we figured out, how a system could detect emojis as faces. But of course, what we did was the beginning of the process. Ultimately, the goal in experimental psychology is to test such theories by experiment, hence the name, experimental psychology. But before we go into the problems of experimental psychology, let's look at the history of psychology as a developing discipline. Earlier in the semester, we briefly looked at criticisms against two psychologists and their theories, Freud and Adler. Their heyday was the 1930s through the 1950s. Today, however, Adlerian psychology is definitely a fringe view. Very few, if any, professional psychologists take his ideas seriously. Freud's theory of psychoanalysis also lost much of its popularity, though some of its core ideas survive in psychodynamic theory today. This doesn't say much, however. Psychodynamic theory itself is a tiny minority view among contemporary psychologists. What happened, you might wonder? Adler's and Freud's dramatic loss of reputation is largely thanks to two people. One of them you already know. He is Karl Popper, the father of falsificationism. Popper said, whatever anybody may do is, in principle, explicable in Freudian or Adlerian terms. The point is clear. Neither Freud nor Adler excludes any particular persons acting in any particular way, whatever the outward circumstances. In contrast, most physical theories are highly falsifiable to start with. And people took note. As I mentioned earlier, Popper was one of the most influential figures in 20th century thought. As much as falsificationism itself had issues of its own as a solution to the demarcation problem, Popper appeared to nail what is wrong with Freud and Adler by pointing out that they can never be proven wrong. One of those people who took note was the American psychologist B.F. Skinner. Skinner took Popper's claim that physical theories are falsifiable as a given. Skinner wanted to make psychology a science like physics and chemistry, a science with falsifiable theories. And Skinner and his followers won. They managed to bury people like Adler and Freud and furnish psychology departments with labs rather than sofas. In a sense, Skinner and his followers managed to pull off a Kuhnian revolution in psychology. Soon after Skinner's revolutionaries beat the old paradigm, however, it became clear that all was not well with the new experimental psychology. David Lyyken, an accomplished and leading experimental psychologist himself, thinks that there are indeed serious problems with experimental psychology. The list of Lyyken's grievances with his own discipline is very long. The first three items come across as condescending whining, at least at first. Lyyken complains that in psychology, most grant applications, as well as most manuscripts submitted into journals and published in journals, are bad. Lyyken seems to appeal to his own authority as an influential psychology researcher, journal editor, board member, and high-level administrator. Still, if that was all he had, it would have been a bit underwhelming as an argument. As you will see soon, however, there is much evidence to support Lyyken's negative judgment about the quality of work in his field. Next, Lyyken complains that most of the published research in his field isn't even read by other scientists. Lyyken made this claim in the early 1990s, where most people still read from physical journals. Today, almost no one reads from paper except for a few dinosaurs such as yours truly. Almost all reading in science happens online, and you can track what happens online. And we know that Lyyken is more correct than he was hoping for. Over 90% of all published research is never read by anyone other than the authors themselves. It gets worse. Remember that the whole point of Skinner's revolution was to make psychology a science with falsifiable theories? Lyyken argues that even that didn't happen. Psychological theories don't get falsified. In the entire now 70-year history of experimental psychology, there isn't a single experiment like the solar eclipse experiment in physics. Instead, psychologists become infatuated with a theory for a while, just like people started wearing those weird leggings a few years ago, and then they drop that theory to play with something else, just like God knows what people will be wearing next summer. It gets even worse. Lyyken argues that most published research in experimental psychology can't be replicated. He gives a few anecdotes to support his claim. But with the benefit of the hindsight, we now know that over half of replication attempts in psychology fail. See the video description for a bibliography in case you want to see the evidence for yourself. This of course explains why most research isn't read. It isn't read because most research is junk. Psychologists are hardworking people, but they are also smart. They aren't going to waste a bunch of time reading what they know is no more reliable than a Ouija board. Low reproducibility also indicates that Lyyken's first three complaints weren't just about an aging man whining about kids these days. There is also little cumulative progress in psychology. This is due to the difficulty of falsifying a theory by experiment and low reproducibility of results. Besides, there is no glory in trying to reproduce a result. Imagine that you're a psychology researcher. What do you want to do? Do you want to exactly repeat what someone else did? Or do you want to design your own experiment, use your own education and brains to come up with something new and creative? Understandably, most people choose the latter. This creates a situation where a researcher has no way of knowing which results to trust and try to build on. Of course, in a situation like this, there can be no cumulative progress to speak of. Each psychologist starts their own research track and pursue it perhaps to retirement. If they are lucky, they might have influenced some grad students on the way who might continue mostly on that track. But when you look at the literature, you cannot find a unified research program where everyone is trying to expand and test. Finally, Lyyken claims that psychology is similar to a cargo cult. If you aren't familiar with the term, be patient. I'll explain it in a bit. But before we do that, let's take a step back and see what Lyyken is trying to do. Lyyken's point isn't just listing a bunch of problems and declaring, see, experimental psychology sucks. He wants to also understand the causes that prevent experimental psychology from succeeding and hopefully offer some remedies. A good place to start that understanding of causes is where we left. Psychology is like a cargo cult, according to Lyyken. What is a cargo cult? A cargo cult is a kind of religion, which we are fortunate enough to be able to see in the making. These things started during World War II, when several technologically primitive island communities in the Pacific Ocean met industrialized nations for the first time. These nations, to be specific, the Empire of Japan and the United States, used those islands as military bases. They used these bases as hubs for shipping large amounts of weapons, munitions, fuel, food, clothing, medicine for the war effort. As you can imagine, the soldiers on the island came into contact with the islanders a lot, and on occasions they shared the surplus food, clothing, and medicine with the islanders. You can also imagine how strange and impressive this must have been for the islanders who saw planes delivering unlimited quantities of goods. When they asked the soldiers, "Where do these things come from?" the soldiers simply replied, "It's cargo." But to understand what that means, what cargo means, you need to understand what mass production is. So the word cargo took a supernatural meaning in the minds of the islanders. They thought that cargo was some sort of process by which their own ancestors were sending them resources, using these powerful foreigners as conduits. Then the war ended, and the United States didn't have to use those islands anymore. American soldiers just packed up and left. The cargo stopped. Then the islanders tried to bring back the cargo by imitating the soldiers stationed on the island. They made aviation goggles from wood and twigs. They made dummy planes out of straw, hoping that perhaps real planes will see them and land on the abandoned strips. The islanders even built radar and control towers without understanding what they did or how they worked. Some of these cargo cults are still alive. They are practiced forms of religion for thousands of people. These people in the picture, for instance, are from the island of Vanuatu, dressed in World War II American uniforms with sticks for guns. They are marching in their annual parade for celebrating the anticipated return of their Messiah, an American GI named John Frum, who, according to their religious faith, will eventually come back to the island with endless cargo. My point here isn't to make fun of these people. Waiting for decades, the return of a possibly fictional GI who must have been by now dead or in at least adult diapers, carrying lots of canned pineapple might strike you as irrational. And it is irrational. But I'm not sure if it is more irrational than waiting for a similar Messiah for 2,000 years. Lyyken thinks that experimental psychology is like a cargo cult because psychologists are imitating the practices encountered in more respected sciences, hoping that the imitation will make psychology similarly respected. I think what he is imagining is a bit like this fictional conversation. A psychologist worries that psychology isn't scientific enough. And this worry is only supported by the views of philosophers and other scientists. Then these psychologists look for a discipline to imitate. A discipline like physics, for instance, whose scientific status they think is beyond reproach. What do physicists have in their research papers? They have numbers and formulas. So, let's put more numbers and formulas in our research, psychologists think. That will surely make what we are doing more scientific. Of course, I'm not denying that numbers and formulas are useful. They are useful, like my hammer is useful. But I don't try to cook with my hammer. Likewise, numbers and formulas are excellent tools for modeling physical phenomena where there are only a few variables to model. But that doesn't mean that they are going to be useful if you try to model much more complicated phenomena. And the phenomena psychologists are studying is immensely more complex than physical phenomena. Here, I don't mean that there is some sort of mysterious, spiritual, non-physical soul science cannot explain. Of course, your mind is physical. What else could it be? Your mind is just your brain, and unfortunately, when your brain dies, your mind will die as well. My point is instead this. Psychology concerns mental functions such as perception, emotion, belief, and imagination. These are abstractions that describe the behavior of your brain at a level that would be impossible to describe just in terms of atoms bumping into each other. And at that level of abstraction, there are just too many variables to account for. There are colors, there are smells, there are tones of voice, social norms about urinals, and conversational implicatures about who has been hitting on whom. There is your first memory of the fuzz coming out of your childhood stuffed animal, and the disturbingly catchy song repeating in your head, although God you hate it. Trying to describe all of this in terms of physical laws, following formulas and equations that can be comprehended by upright monkeys like ourselves is a lost cause. As a practical matter, it is useless. So a psychologist has to grapple with exceedingly complex phenomena with innumerable variables to control. That's just a given. There is no way around that fact. And that's part of the reason numbers don't help a psychologist all that much. They might even obfuscate, as we will see soon. But according to Lyyken, there are things psychologists can do to improve the quality of research in their discipline and hopefully make their claims more worthy of belief. First, they can just drop jargon, which is rampant in psychology. Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher and mathematician, relays a striking example of such pointless jargon used by a psychologist. Quoting the psychologist, Russell writes, "Human beings are completely exempt from undesirable behavioral patterns only when certain prerequisites, not satisfied except in a small percentage of actual cases, have through some fortuitous concourse of favorable circumstances, whether congenital or environmental, chance to combine in producing an individual in whom many factors deviate from the norm in a socially advantageous manner." This passage is a nightmare of comprehension because it is full of jargon. What is an undesirable behavior pattern? What does it mean to deviate from the norm in a socially advantageous manner? Who writes like that? Apparently, a lot of psychologists. As Russell points out, everything in that passage can be said simply without any jargon. You could just write, "Almost all men are scoundrels. Those who are not must have had unusual luck, both in their birth and in their upbringing." Another thing that is in the control of psychologists, according to Lyyken, is dropping the ritual use of statistical tools such as the null hypothesis significance testing, which we will cover in the next lecture. Like cognitive neuroscience, it's an open question whether we should brand experimental psychology as pathological, which have some salient features as we observed earlier. Although there is some overlap, there are also differences, just like it was the case with cognitive neuroscience. So in an ironic twist, the situation with experimental psychology, which Fodor offered as an alternative to cognitive neuroscience, turns out to be somewhat comparable to cognitive neuroscience. Finally, and similarly, the lessons we get from our survey of the problems with experimental psychology yields similar conclusions. But this brings me to the end of this lecture. Send me an email if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience, and I'll catch you next time.